In September 1874, deep within the coal mountains of West Virginia, 3 armed men vanished without a trace near Elkhorn Creek. Days later, their bodies were discovered in shallow graves along the muddy banks. Each had fatal gunshot wounds inflicted by a weapon the killer couldn't handle. The sole witness to their deaths was a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Weaver, who emerged from the same mountains with a rifle nearly as tall as himself. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and his voice was eerily calm for a child who had just lost everything. Local authorities buried the investigation as quickly as they buried the bodies, but the miners who found these bodies still whisper about the boy's cold, piercing gaze and the 3 words he spoke when asked about the killings. They deserved worse. The case files from that autumn remain sealed in the basement of the Mercer County Courthouse with a simple notation, "Matter resolved by mutual agreement." Further investigation suspended by order of Sheriff W. Thornton. Before we continue the story of Thomas Weaver and the dark secrets that carried him into the Appalachian Mountains, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell. And let us know in the comments which state you're tuning in from, as these mountains hold more secrets than you can imagine. The authorities didn't want anyone to know that these 3 dead men were not random victims of mountain justice. They were enforcers for the Consolidated Coal Company, and Thomas Weaver had just declared war on the most powerful corporation in West Virginia. But the true horror of this story lies not in what happened that September night at Elkhorn Creek, but in what unfolded in the following months as a child's thirst for vengeance reshaped the landscape of fear across an entire region. By the autumn of 1874, the mountains of West Virginia had been transformed by an industry that devoured coal and men with equal hunger. Small communities that had survived for generations on hunting, farming, and timber were now trembling under the roar of mining machinery and the constant rumble of coal trains snaking through valleys that had once known only bird song. Even the air had changed. Where once the crisp mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and wild flowers, it was now thick with the smell of coal dust and sulfur, a metallic tang that coated the tongue and stained the lungs of everyone who breathed it. The Consolidated Coal Company had bought up vast tracts of land across the region, bringing not just jobs but a system of justice that answered to no local law. Company towns sprouted like toxic mushrooms on clear cuts carved from ancient forests. Their hastily constructed buildings already showed signs of the subsidence that would eventually swallow entire blocks as the mines expanded beneath them. In these isolated hollows, where the nearest sheriff might be a day's ride away over treacherous mountain passes, the company's security force, known locally as the Coal Police, served as judge, jury, and often executioner for any miner who dared challenge working conditions, wages, or the company's iron grip on every aspect of daily life. These men wore no uniforms, carried no badges, but their authority extended far beyond the mines. They decided who could shop at the company store, whose children could attend the company school, whose families would be evicted for failing to meet quotas or show sufficient loyalty. The Coal Police were drawn from the dregs of post-Civil War society, former Confederate soldiers who found no place in the new America, discharged Union veterans whose wartime experiences had accustomed them to violence, drifters and criminals who discovered that corporate employment offered both protection from the law and unlimited opportunities for brutality. They lived in a boarding house on the outskirts of Beckley, a ramshackle building that locals called the Devil's Rest, where they spent their off-duty hours drinking rotgut whiskey and devising new methods of intimidation. Families like the Weavers, who had worked these mountains for 3 generations, found themselves caught between the promise of steady wages and the reality of debt servitude. The company paid in scrip that could only be redeemed at company stores where prices were inflated. To ensure that workers remained perpetually in debt, housing was provided in company-owned shacks that leaked in winter and baked in summer, with rent automatically deducted from wages that never quite stretched to cover the necessities. Thomas Weaver lived with his father, Samuel, and older brother, Jacob in a cabin overlooking Elkhorn Creek, where his grandfather Ezekiel had settled after the War of 1812. The cabin was one of the few independent homesteads left in the area. Built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered 40 years of mountain storms, its walls were lined with deer hides and bear skins that Ezekiel had taken in the days when game was plentiful, before mining operations drove most of it deeper into the mountains. Samuel Weaver was a man shaped by hard choices and harsh circumstances. At 38, his hands were rough from years of swinging a pick, his lungs scarred from inhaling coal dust, his back permanently bowed from crawling through tunnels where even a child would have to stoop. He had fought for the Union during the Civil War, serving in the 1st West Virginia Volunteer Infantry, and the experience had taught him the value of discipline and the terrible cost of violence. Returning home in 1865, he had hoped to resume the quiet life of a mountain farmer. But the arrival of the coal company made those dreams impossible. The morning shift at mine number 7 began before dawn, when the mountain air was so cold that breath formed crystalline clouds and the ground crunched with frost under heavy boots. Samuel would wake Thomas and Jacob with a gentle shake, speaking in whispers so as not to disturb neighbors who worked different shifts and needed their sleep. Breakfast was usually cornmeal mush with molasses, sometimes supplemented with eggs from the family's 3 surviving hens. The others had perished from breathing the cold dust that settled on everything within miles of the mines. At 17, Jacob possessed the restless energy and quick temper that Samuel had learned to suppress during years of dealing with company supervisors. The boy stood nearly 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and large hands that marked him as his father's son, but there was a rebellious spark in his eyes that deeply troubled Samuel. 6 months earlier, Jacob had begun working as a timberman, responsible for setting the wooden supports that prevented tunnel collapses. It was dangerous work, requiring both physical strength and keen attention to detail. One improperly placed beam could lead to a cave-in that buried entire crews. The boy had already seen 3 men die in preventable accidents caused by the company's refusal to purchase necessary safety equipment when Jacob complained to his supervisor about rotting beams that should have been replaced weeks ago. He was told that any questioning of company procedures was grounds for immediate dismissal. The conversation ended with Jacob's supervisor, a hard-faced man named Garrett Mills, snidely remarking how easily accidents could be arranged for someone who continued to cause trouble. Thomas was different from both his father and brother in ways that unsettled even his own family. Despite his 12 years, he possessed a disquieting intelligence that manifested in his ability to read people's intentions and motives with uncanny accuracy. While other children played games and told stories, Thomas watched and calculated, noting patterns in adult behavior that allowed him to predict their actions with disturbing precision. His mother Mary had died in childbirth during the harsh winter of 1862, when medical help was unavailable and Samuel was away at war. Thomas had been raised primarily by his grandfather Ezekiel, a man whose own experiences in the War of 1812 and decades of frontier life had taught him that the world was a place where weakness invited destruction. Under Ezekiel's tutelage, Thomas learned to hunt, track game, and shoot with a skill that impressed even seasoned woodsmen. The rifle he carried was a Spencer .44 for caliber repeating rifle, one of the most advanced firearms of its time. Ezekiel had acquired it from a dying Union soldier during the retreat from Richmond and maintained it in perfect working order in the years since. The weapon held 7 cartridges in its tubular magazine and could fire as rapidly as the shooter could work the lever action, giving an experienced marksman a significant advantage over opponents armed with single-shot weapons. But Thomas's education extended far beyond marksmanship. Ezekiel taught him to move silently through dense forest, to read the signs and tracks that indicated the passage of both animals and men, to find water and shelter in wilderness terrain, and, most importantly, to think like a predator when circumstances demanded it. The old man had survived times when civilization's rules offered no protection against its failures, and he passed these lessons to his grandson with a thoroughness that would have horrified more civilized observers. By September 1874, tensions between the miners and the Consolidated Coal Company had reached a breaking point, threatening to erupt into open warfare. That summer, wages had been cut twice, while the company store raised prices on essential goods like flour, bacon, and kerosene, driving families deeper into debt with each passing month. Children went to bed hungry while company officials lived in mansions built on the blood and sweat of mountain families. Safety conditions in the mines had deteriorated to the point where cave-ins occurred almost weekly, yet any miner who refused to work in clearly dangerous conditions was immediately blacklisted by the coal police and often run out of town. The company's attitude was simple: men could be replaced, but coal could not. If men died extracting it, there were always more desperate families willing to take their place. The coal police grew increasingly bold in their intimidation tactics, no longer confining themselves to mining camps but extending their reach into independent settlements where families like the Weavers still maintained some semblance of autonomy. Homes were searched without warrants, livestock vanished overnight, and anyone who spoke out against company policies found themselves receiving nighttime visits from men who made their intentions clear without uttering direct threats. The troubles that would eventually result in 3 graves by Elkhorn Creek began on September 15th, when Samuel Weaver made a decision that would define the rest of his life. That morning, as he descended into the suffocating darkness of mine number 7 for what he already knew would be his last shift, Samuel carried with him a petition that was the result of months of careful preparation and significant personal risk, written in Samuel's precise hand on paper purchased with money the family could barely afford. The document detailed specific safety violations that management had ignored despite repeated worker complaints. It described rotting wooden supports that groaned ominously under the weight of unstable rock, ventilation systems so inadequate that men regularly collapsed from inhaling toxic gases, and the company's practice of forcing miners to work with equipment so faulty that accidents were not just probable but inevitable. Most damningly, the petition detailed the company's policy of intimidating workers who refused to enter clearly dangerous areas. It named specific supervisors who had told miners that any questioning of safety procedures would result in immediate dismissal and blacklisting, effectively forcing men to choose between their own lives and the ability to feed their families. 47 miners had signed the petition, each understanding that by putting his name to this document, he might be signing away his livelihood or his life. These were not radical agitators or outside troublemakers, but ordinary mountain men who had simply reached the limits of their endurance. They had seen friends die in preventable accidents, watched children grow thin and weak from hunger, and helplessly endured as elderly parents suffered from illnesses that could have been treated if company doctors hadn't been instructed to minimize treatment costs. Samuel's plan was to present the petition to mine foreman Augustus Blackwood during the shift change, when other workers would be present as witnesses and the supervisor would be less inclined toward immediate violence. It was a sound strategy that demonstrated Samuel's understanding of company politics and his hope that rational dialogue was still possible. What Samuel didn't know was that one of the miners who had signed the petition, a desperate man named Henry Coldwell, had accumulated such massive debts at the company store that he would do anything to avoid eviction from his company housing. Coldwell's youngest daughter suffered from consumption, and he had been told that her continued access to the company doctor depended on his cooperation with management. Faced with a choice between loyalty to his fellow workers and his child's life, Coldwell made the only choice and father could make. By the time Samuel descended the wooden ladder into the mine that morning, Augustus Blackwood already knew about the petition and had alerted the coal police that immediate action would be required. The foreman, a cruel man who had earned his position through a combination of political connections and willingness to use violence against workers, saw the petition not as a legitimate grievance but as an act of insurrection that threatened the entire system of control that kept the mines profitable. The confrontation, when it came, was brief and decisive. Samuel presented the petition with quiet dignity, explaining that these men didn't want to cause trouble, they simply wanted to work under conditions that didn't guarantee their deaths. Blackwood listened in silence, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face, then tore the document to shreds and scattered the pieces through the mine like confetti. "I want every man who signed this document in my office after the shift ends," Blackwood said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "We need to discuss their continued employment with this company." Samuel immediately understood that reporting to Blackwood's office would be tantamount to signing his own death warrant. The foreman's discussions with troublesome workers were notorious for ending in accidents that left no witnesses and asked no questions. But he also knew that failing to appear would have even more serious consequences, not just for himself but for his family. That evening, as the Weaver family sat down to their usual supper of cornbread, beans, and rabbit that Thomas had brought in from the morning's hunt, Samuel explained the situation to his sons with the careful precision of a man who knew that words might be all he had left to give them. He spoke of duty and honor, of the difference between courage and foolishness, and of the terrible choices that circumstances sometimes forced decent men to make. Jacob's reaction was immediate and predictable. He wanted to fight, to gather weapons and allies, and confront the company thugs with the direct violence that young men have always believed could solve complex problems. Thomas listened in silence, his dark eyes moving between his father and brother, absorbing not just their words but the hidden emotions that revealed their true intentions far more clearly than they could have expressed themselves. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. The slow, deliberate hoofbeats announced the arrival of visitors who were in no hurry, confident that their prey had known where to run. Samuel stood slowly, his hand instinctively checking the position of his hunting knife at his belt, then moved to the cabin's single window and peered through the glass clouded by years of cold dust. 3 men were dismounting with the casual confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. Samuel recognized them immediately. Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchison, and James Crawford, the triumvirate of violence that enforced the coal company's will across the region. Their presence at his cabin meant that whatever happened next had been planned and approved at the highest levels of corporate leadership. Marcus Finch was the unofficial leader of the coal police, a former Confederate cavalry officer whose unit had gained notoriety during the war for its treatment of Union prisoners. Finch was tall and gaunt, with prematurely gray hair and eyes like shards of winter ice. He possessed a cruel intelligence that made him particularly effective at psychological intimidation. He dressed better than his companions, his black suit always immaculate despite the rough nature of his work, and carried a pair of iconic revolvers in holsters that showed the wear marks of frequent use. Dale Hutchison was Finch's opposite in nearly every respect. A massive man whose bulk consisted more of muscle than fat, his scarred hands testified to a lifetime of solving problems with brute force. He had come to West Virginia after the war with stories of service in Sherman's army that no one could verify but no one dared question. Hutchison enjoyed his work, taking pleasure in the fear he inspired and the pain he inflicted when subtle intimidation failed. He provided object lessons that kept other potential troublemakers in line. James Crawford was the most dangerous of the 3 precisely because he seemed the least threatening, of average height and build, with thinning chestnut hair and unremarkable features. Crawford looked more like a clerk or a salesman than a killer. But those who knew him understood that beneath his ordinary appearance lay a complete absence of human empathy. Crawford killed without anger or passion, viewing violence as just another tool to be employed when necessary. He was called upon to handle situations that required planning and precision rather than brute force. The conversation that followed would be the last civil exchange between the Weaver family and the Consolidated Coal Company. Speaking with the casual authority of a man accustomed to fear, Finch informed Samuel that his petition had been noted and that his employment with the company was terminated effective immediately. Moreover, the Weaver family had 30 days to vacate their cabin, which stood on land recently acquired by the company as part of an expansion up the Elkhorn Creek Valley. The claim of land ownership was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that became truth when backed by superior firepower and corrupt officials. The coal company had perfected the art of property theft using forged documents, witness intimidation, and judges who understood which side contributed to election campaigns. Families who had owned land for generations suddenly found their deeds invalidated, their property taxes miscalculated, or their boundary lines redrawn. Jacob, young and hot-tempered like his father at that age, made the mistake of asking what compensation they would receive for the improvements they had made to the home over the years. It was a reasonable question, even a polite one, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. This was not a business negotiation or a legal proceeding. It was a demonstration of power intended to crush resistance before it could spread. Hutchison's response was swift and brutal. A backhanded slap sent the 17-year-old crashing against the cabin wall, blood pouring from his nose and lips. The blow was calculated for maximum humiliation without causing permanent damage, violence that delivered a message while leaving the victim capable of delivering that message to others. But the real horror began when Samuel moved to help his son. Crawford, who had been standing silently in the background, drew a nickel-plated Remington revolver and pressed the barrel against Samuel's temple with the casual precision of a man who had done this many times before. The weapon was loaded with 44 caliber rounds capable of splattering a man's brains across the cabin wall, and everyone in the room understood that Crawford would pull the trigger without hesitation if circumstances required it. "You seem to have forgotten who runs these mountains, Weaver," Crawford said, barely above a whisper, but his voice carried clearly through the sudden silence. "Perhaps it's time you and your son learned some respect for your betters." What happened next would haunt Thomas Weaver for the rest of his short life and shape his understanding of how the world truly worked beneath the veneer of civilization and law. As Samuel stood frozen with the gun pressed to his head and Jacob lay bleeding on the floor, the three coal police began discussing the fate of the Weaver family with the detached professionalism of men planning a business transaction. Finch suggested that Samuel and Jacob should simply disappear, their bodies never to be found, leaving Thomas as a living reminder to other families of what happened to those who challenged the company's authority. Hutchison preferred a more public example, a hanging that could be staged to look like vigilante justice, with the bodies left to rot as a warning to other potential troublemakers. Crawford, as always, favored the option that would attract the least attention from outside authorities, proposing that the men be taken into the mountains and buried where they would never be found. Thomas, who had been sitting silently in the corner throughout this discussion, watched as the three men marched his father and brother outside at gunpoint. From the cabin window, he saw them being led toward the forest. Finch carried a length of hemp rope that glistened with moisture in the fading light. Crawford had a shovel, and Hutchison carried a canvas sack likely filled with lime to hasten decomposition. With icy certainty, the boy knew his family would not be returning from the dark woods, but Thomas Weaver was not as helpless as the coal police believed, and he had been preparing for this moment far longer than they realized. As the voices of the three men faded into the forest surrounding Elkhorn Creek, Thomas moved with the silent efficiency that his grandfather had drilled into him during countless hours of training. The Spencer rifle was retrieved from a hiding place beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace, along with a leather cartridge belt holding 47.44 caliber rounds. Each cartridge had been carefully stored and inspected, each one potentially A matter of life and death, the weapon felt familiar in his hands, the walnut stock smooth from years of use, the metal parts gleaming beneath a thin layer of oil that prevented rust in the damp mountain climate. Thomas had fired this rifle thousands of times, practicing on targets ranging from tin cans at 50 yards to playing cards at twice that distance. He could load and fire 7 shots in under 30 seconds, and his accuracy was so remarkable that local hunters regularly sought his advice on the best hunting spots. But tonight, Thomas wasn't hunting deer or rabbits. Tonight, he was stalking the most dangerous game the mountains had to offer, men who killed for money and pleasure and who had made the mistake of believing that a 12-year-old boy posed no threat to their plans. The darkness that seemed to favor the coal police actually worked to Thomas's advantage. He had spent countless nights moving through these woods and understood how sound traveled differently depending on wind direction and atmospheric conditions. He knew every deer trail and rabbit run, every fallen log that could provide cover, every rocky outcrop that offered a clear field of fire while concealing a shooter's position. But most importantly, Thomas understood something about violence that his father and brother had never learned. The first rule of any fight was to ensure your opponent didn't realize he was in one until it was too late to change the outcome. The coal police had planned to commit murder that night, but they expected their only opponents to be two unarmed men already under their control. Following the voices deeper into the forest, Thomas moved parallel to their path rather than directly behind them, using his superior knowledge of the terrain to anticipate their route. The sound of their conversation indicated they were heading for Hangman's Hollow, a small clearing by a tributary of Elkhorn Creek where the trees formed a natural amphitheater. The site provided both seclusion for their work and easy access to running water for washing away evidence. The clearing had earned its grim name during the Civil War, when irregular Confederate forces used it to execute Union prisoners who couldn't be ransomed or exchanged. Local children were warned away from the place not because of any supernatural threat, but because human bones still occasionally surfaced when spring floods disturbed the soil. It was exactly the kind of location men like Finch, Hutchison, and Crawford typically chose for their work, isolated, historically significant, and psychologically terrifying to their victims. Thomas reached the edge of the clearing as the coal police were still making their way through the dense forest below. Their progress was slowed by the need to control to prisoners and navigate unfamiliar terrain in near-total darkness. He positioned himself on a rocky outcrop overlooking the clearing, which provided a direct line of fire to several positions and concealment behind a growth of mountain laurel. The waiting was the hardest part. Thomas lay motionless behind his improvised cover. The Spencer rifle braced against a natural depression in the rock that served as a steady rest. As the men's voices gradually grew closer, he could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the night breeze. Hutchison was complaining about the distance they'd had to travel. Crawford was discussing the optimal depth for graves in rocky mountain soil. Finch was making crude jokes about Samuel's petition and what the other miners would think when they heard of his disappearance. When the four figures finally emerged into the clearing, Thomas could see them clearly in the faint starlight filtering through the forest canopy. Samuel and Jacob were bound with rope, their hands tied behind their backs. They stumbled occasionally as their captors pushed them forward. The coal police had clearly grown complacent, believing the isolation of the location made escape or rescue impossible. Marcus Finch directed the operation with the casual authority of a man who had overseen many such executions. He ordered Hutchison to put the prisoners on their knees beside a fallen oak that would serve as a convenient barrier for containing the bodies. Crawford began digging what was clearly intended to be a shallow grave, working with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had performed this task many times before. The first shot came without warning. The crack of the Spencer rifle echoed through the clearing like thunder, and a .44 for caliber bullet struck Marcus Finch in the chest. The impact lifted him off his feet and threw him into the creek, where his body floated face down in water that quickly darkened with blood. Hutchison and Crawford, completely taken by surprise by the attack from an impossible direction, dove for cover, shouting threats and curses into the surrounding darkness. But Thomas had already relocated, sliding down from his rocky perch to a new position while the echo of his first shot still reverberated through the forest. The Spencer's lever action allowed for rapid firing, and Thomas had practiced this sequence so many times that his hands worked almost unconsciously. Eject the spent casing, chamber a new round, acquire the target, control the breath, and squeeze the trigger evenly. The entire cycle took less than 3 seconds. By the time Hutchison realized where the shot had come from, Thomas was already gone. The second bullet found Dale Hutchison as he attempted to use Jacob as a human shield. The shot passed through the Cole policeman's skull before he could carry out his threat to kill the youth. Hutchison's massive body pitched forward, pinning Jacob to the ground with its weight, but leaving the 17-year-old unharmed. Crawford, now alone against an enemy he couldn't see or understand, made the fatal mistake of panicking instead of taking cover and trying to locate his attacker. He abandoned the prisoners and ran for the forest in a desperate attempt to reach his horse. It was exactly the reaction Thomas had anticipated from a man accustomed to overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. The final shot was the most difficult, requiring Thomas to judge Crawford's speed and trajectory while accounting for the movement of tree branches that partially obscured the target. But his grandfather had taught him to hunt running deer in dense forest, and a fleeing man presented a much larger and more predictable target than a frightened white tail. Crawford was 20 yards from the tree line when the third bullet struck him between the shoulder blades, sending him crashing face first into the muddy bank of the creek. His body slid down the embankment and came to rest half submerged in the same water that carried Marcus Finch's blood away. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of running water and the heavy breathing of Samuel and Jacob Weaver, who stared at the three corpses as they tried to comprehend how their youngest family member had just saved their lives. Thomas emerged from the forest like a ghost, the Spencer rifle held casually in his small hands, his expression as calm as if he had just returned from hunting rabbits. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling to cut his father's bonds with a hunting knife that seemed to appear from nowhere. His voice was steady, almost conversational, with no trace of the excitement or horror that should have followed such violence. Samuel, whose hands trembled as circulation returned, could only stare at his younger son, trying to process what had just happened. The boy had moved through the forest in complete darkness, taken an optimal firing position, and eliminated 3 armed men with a precision that would have impressed professional soldiers. "The most important thing," Thomas said, showing no signs of emotional distress or moral conflict over what he had done, "is that they were going to kill you. I couldn't let that happen." The simplicity of his reasoning was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire incident. Thomas had acted not out of anger or fear, but from a calculated assessment of the situation and a practical solution to the problem at hand. He had killed 3 men without emotion, much as he might have hunted rabbits to supplement the family dinner table, but the true horror of that night was yet to be revealed, for Samuel and Jacob didn't understand that. Thomas had been preparing for this moment for months. The location he had chosen for his ambush, the route he had taken through the forest, even the timing of his shots, all had been carefully rehearsed during countless hours of solitary practice. Thomas had known that the coal company would come for his family eventually and had prepared accordingly. The only surprise was that they had waited so long. The plan that Samuel devised during those desperate hours at Elkhorn Creek was both brilliant and heartbreaking in its simplicity, but it was Thomas who provided the crucial details that made the deception plausible. As the 3 men stood beside the bodies of their would-be killers, the boy outlined a strategy that demonstrated a disturbing understanding of human psychology and institutional corruption. The 3 dead Cole police would be buried where they fell, their disappearance explained by the dangerous nature of their work and the hostile territory they patrolled. Samuel and Jacob would fake their own deaths, leaving evidence to convince investigators that they had been killed in retaliation for the guard's disappearance. Thomas, armed with a story carefully crafted by his father but refined by his own understanding of adult thought patterns, would become the sole survivor of a tragedy that never actually occurred, but the plan required sacrifices that would haunt the surviving weavers for the rest of their lives. Samuel and Jacob would have to give up not just their home and possessions, but their very identities, traveling hundreds of miles to start new lives under assumed names with relatives who had agreed to take them in without asking questions. They would never be able to return to the West Virginia hills, never be able to contact Thomas directly, never know how their sacrifice had shaped the boy's development. Thomas, meanwhile, would remain behind to face a world that had already shown its willingness to destroy him, armed only with his intelligence, his rifle, and a growing understanding that survival sometimes required becoming more dangerous than the forces that threatened you. He would be alone as no child should ever be, keeping secrets that would wall him off from any normal human relationships he might attempt to build. The burial of the 3 Cole police took most of the night. Samuel and Jacob worked by moonlight, digging graves deep enough to prevent discovery but shallow enough to finish before dawn. Thomas served as lookout, his sharp ears catching any sounds that might indicate the approach of riders or hunters. The boy also provided practical advice about soil composition and drainage that spoke to his disturbing familiarity with the techniques of body disposal. The graves were located beneath the sprawling roots of an ancient oak where the disturbed earth would be less noticeable and the roots would eventually grow through the remains, making exhumation virtually impossible. Thomas suggested scattering leaf litter and forest duff over the sites, then marking them with barely visible burn marks on nearby trees that would be invisible to casual observers but allow him to find the graves if necessary. As dawn approached, the 3 weavers gathered their meager belongings and prepared for the deception that would protect Samuel and Jacob while transforming Thomas into something no 12-year-old child should ever become. Samuel took his son aside for a final conversation that would serve as both farewell and instruction for the years of solitude that lay ahead. "Remember that we love you," Samuel said, his voice breaking despite his best efforts to maintain his composure. "Remember that what we're doing is necessary not just to save our lives, but to protect other families from what's happened to us. And remember that someday, when you're grown and strong, you'll have the power to make sure this never happens again." Thomas nodded with the solemn seriousness of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly, but his dark eyes reflected an understanding that went far beyond his years. He had already begun making plans that his father couldn't imagine, plans that would extend far beyond mere survival to include a systematic campaign of retribution against all those who had contributed to his family's destruction. The crime scene staged by Thomas and his father in the cabin was a masterpiece of misdirection capable of confusing even experienced investigators. Furniture was overturned to suggest a struggle. Blood from a cut on Jacob's hand was splattered in patterns indicative of violence, and some of Samuel's possessions were taken to suggest that the attackers had seized trophies. But most importantly, Thomas planted evidence that would lead investigators to conclude that his father and brother had been taken alive, presumably for questioning or public execution. By the time hunters found Thomas 3 days later, walking along a mountain trail with his grandfather's rifle and blood-stained clothes, the boy had transformed himself into the perfect victim. He was traumatized but resolute, willing to help but not too knowledgeable, sympathetic but not so much that he required the kind of intensive care that might reveal inconsistencies in his story. He told Sheriff William Thornton that the blood on his clothes came from trying to help his wounded father before he was dragged away by soldiers. The tears in his clothing resulted from running through the dark forest from men who threatened to hunt him down if he tried to interfere. His apparent calm was a symptom of shock often accompanying traumatic events, a reasonable explanation that no one questioned too closely in a child who had clearly suffered terrible losses. Sheriff Thornton had survived the chaos of Reconstruction by learning not to ask too many questions and when to accept explanations that satisfied the letter of the law without probing too deeply into uncomfortable truths. At 53, he had seen enough violence and corruption to understand that sometimes the best solution was the one that prevented further bloodshed, even if it meant compromising one's principles. The discovery of the 3 bodies changed everything, transforming what had seemed like a straightforward case of corporate intimidation into something far more complex and dangerous. When Thornton's search party found the bodies buried in shallow graves near Uncanny Creek, the sheriff realized he was dealing with a situation that could destroy not just his career but the entire economic foundation of the county. The men had been shot with a precision that suggested military training or exceptional skill with firearms. Yet the only suspect was a child who should have been running in terror rather than engaging in armed combat with experienced killers. The positioning of the bodies indicated they had been shot by someone firing from an elevated position, but the terrain around the burial site offered no such vantage point. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in selective blindness and willful ignorance. Faced with pressure from both the mining company and his conscience, Sheriff Thornton chose to accept a version of events that satisfied the requirements of the law while avoiding the more disturbing implications of what had actually occurred. The official report stated that Marcus Finch, Dale Hutchison, and James Crawford had been killed during an altercation with Samuel and Jacob Weaver, who subsequently fled the scene. Thomas Weaver, found traumatized and alone, was the sole surviving witness to what was described as a dispute over mining operations that had turned violent, but certain details troubled those who knew the truth. The precision of the shooting suggested a single gunman of remarkable skill rather than the desperate firefight described in the official report. Most disturbing of all was Thomas himself. Rather than displaying the grief and confusion expected of a child who had lost his entire family, the boy exhibited an almost preternatural composure that unsettled everyone who encountered him. When asked about the details of that night, he would fix the questioner with his dark eyes and provide answers that were technically truthful without revealing anything substantial. Men from the company came for Papa and Jacob. There was shooting. I ran into the woods and hid until morning. The Consolidated Coal Company, faced with the loss of 3 key security personnel and a story that cast their security operations in an unfavorable light, made a decision that would prove to be their second fatal mistake. Rather than conducting a thorough investigation, they chose to quietly bury the matter while implementing new policies aimed at preventing similar incidents. Company leadership reasoned that the deaths of 3 coal police, while regrettable, were preferable to a prolonged investigation that might reveal the extent of their intimidation tactics. They failed to understand that Thomas Weaver had acted not out of desperation or fear, but from a calculated understanding that some problems could only be solved through violence. The decision to retreat rather than retaliate was seen by the boy not as wisdom but as weakness, and this perception would have deadly consequences in the months that followed. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in the West Virginia mountains grows even darker. If this story sends chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss stories like this one. Let's uncover together what happened next in the story of Thomas Weaver. That year, winter came early to the mountains, bringing with it a series of accidents that began to shift the balance of power across the entire coal mining region. Company supervisors, notorious for their harsh treatment of workers, mysteriously fell into mine shafts. Store managers who had been gouging families with inflated prices were found dead in their homes, victims of apparent robberies gone wrong that left money untouched but took lives with surgical precision. The truth about Thomas Weaver began to emerge in February 1876 when Sheriff Thornton received an urgent message that changed his understanding of everything that had happened since that September night at Elkhorn Creek. The message came from Dr. Marcus Henley, the company physician who treated injured miners, and contained information that made Thornton's blood run cold. Over the past month, 3 more company employees had died. Each death had initially appeared accidental, but upon closer examination revealed disturbing patterns. Mine foreman Garrett Mills had fallen into a shaft during a routine inspection, but witnesses reported he had been standing well back from the edge when he suddenly pitched forward as if struck by an unseen force. Store manager Vernon Powell was found dead in his locked office, apparently from a heart attack, but the coroner discovered a small puncture wound behind his left ear, suggesting a thin blade had been inserted with surgical precision. Most troubling was the death of Augustus Blackwood, the mine foreman who had torn up Samuel's petition. Blackwood was discovered at home, sitting at his kitchen table with a cooling cup of coffee, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. There were no signs of violence, no indication of how an intruder might have entered or escaped. Yet Blackwood was unmistakably dead, his cause of death something the doctor could only describe as a catastrophic failure of the nervous system. The message from Dr. Henley contained a detail that convinced Thornton immediate action was necessary. Each victim had been found with a small scrap of paper in their pocket, apparently placed there after death. On each paper was written a single word in neat, childish handwriting: Justice. That same day, Thornton rode alone into the mountains, along a trail leading to a secluded valley miles from town where local hunters had reported seeing smoke from a small campfire. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life and force him to confront the true extent of what Thomas Weaver had become. The boy had constructed what could only be described as a training camp, complete with carefully designed targets, obstacle courses, and detailed maps of all company facilities in the region. Wooden figures placed at various distances and elevations presented different tactical challenges. Each was designed to simulate specific scenarios in which company personnel might be vulnerable to attack. But these were not the crude targets a child might use for innocent play. They were anatomically precise representations of human beings, carved with disturbing attention to detail and marked with accurate indications of vital organs, arterial pathways, and optimal angles for delivering fatal wounds. Some targets were rigged to simulate moving prey, suspended from ropes and pulleys that allowed them to swing or rotate unpredictably. Most chilling was a detailed journal Thomas had kept, recording his observations of the daily routines of company personnel, their habits and weaknesses, their fears and vulnerabilities. The journal contained floor plans of their homes, schedules of their movements, and psychological profiles demonstrating an understanding of human nature that seemed impossible for someone his age. When Thomas emerged from a stand of mountain laurel carrying his grandfather's Spencer rifle with the casual familiarity of a professional soldier, Sheriff Thornton found himself face to face with something that defied simple classification. The boy still looked like a child, small for his 13 years, with dark hair and serious eyes, but his demeanor spoke of someone who had traveled far beyond ordinary human experience. "I've been expecting you, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice lacking any of the qualities adults typically expected from children. Dr. Henley would have noticed these patterns eventually. He was more observant than most company employees. The conversation that followed revealed the true scope of Thomas's campaign against the coal company and the methodical precision with which he had planned and executed his vengeance. He described each killing with the detached professionalism of a military officer briefing a superior, explaining the tactical considerations that had influenced his choice of methods and timing. Garrett Mills had been responsible for safety violations that resulted in the deaths of at least 6 men whose complaints about unsafe conditions had been ignored. Vernon Powell had set prices at the company store so high that children literally starved, using his position to extort sexual favors from desperate wives whose husbands couldn't afford basic necessities. Augustus Blackwood had been responsible for a cave-in 2 years earlier that killed Thomas's cousin, deliberately ignoring structural problems because repairs would have interfered with production quotas. Each had received exactly what they deserved, Thomas explained with chilling calm. Mills had fallen to his death like the miners whose safety he had neglected. Powell died slowly and painfully as the children of families who couldn't afford food. Starved, Blackwood died of fear, the same fear he had used to control workers who dared challenge his decisions. When Sheriff Thornton asked how a 13-year-old boy had acquired the knowledge and skills necessary to carry out such sophisticated killings, Thomas's answer revealed the true horror of what the coal industry had created. His grandfather Ezekiel hadn't just taught him to hunt and shoot, but had passed on the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of mountain people who had survived by being more dangerous than the dangers that surrounded them. The old man had fought in 2 wars, endured the worst violence of the frontier period, and understood that sometimes civilization's rules offered no protection against its failures. He had trained Thomas not just as a hunter, but as a weapon to be employed when ordinary methods of justice proved inadequate. The old man had always said that sheep created wolves when they forgot to be shepherds. Thomas continued, his dark eyes reflecting a wisdom no child should possess. The coal company had forgotten that mountain people had been killing their enemies long before there were corporations. The most bone-chilling moment came when Sheriff Thornton directly asked if Thomas felt any remorse for taking lives. The boy considered the question with the gravity of someone pondering a deep philosophical issue, then gave an answer that would haunt Thornton for decades in his nightmares. "Sheriff, do you feel remorse when you put down a rabid dog? Those men were diseases that infected everything they touched. They destroyed families, killed children through neglect and greed, turned honest work into a form of slavery. I didn't kill them, I performed surgery on a sick community. The only tragedy is that it took so long for someone to do what needed to be done." The final confrontation between Thomas Weaver and the forces that had shaped his young life came not through violence, but through negotiations that would haunt Sheriff Thornton for the rest of his days. Sitting by Elkhorn Creek, where 3 bodies had once been buried, Thornton found himself bargaining with a child who spoke with the cold precision of a military strategist. Thomas had no intention of simply disappearing. His demands were specific and non-negotiable: compensation for the families of miners killed in preventable accidents, immediate installation of safety equipment, and an end to the reign of terror by the coal police. But most chilling was his insistence on written guarantees, documents that would bind the company to its promises. "Do you think this ends with me leaving?" Thomas said, his 13-year-old voice carrying an authority that made Thornton's skin crawl. "I've already taught them something they'll never forget: fear. Before, they slept soundly knowing they had guns and money. Now they understand there are predators in these mountains they never knew existed." The negotiations took 3 days. Faced with the prospect of further losses against an enemy they couldn't see or catch, company leadership agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. But Thomas wasn't satisfied with promises. He demanded proof of compliance, regular reports, and most disturbingly, established a network of miners' children who would serve as his eyes and ears throughout the region. The transformation that followed Thomas's departure was immediate and profound. Within weeks, safety equipment that had been lacking for years suddenly appeared in the mines. Prices at company stores dropped overnight. The most brutal overseers were quietly transferred to remote locations, and the coal police simply vanished. Their boarding house at Devil's Rest was abandoned so quickly that food rotted on the tables, but Sheriff Thornton discovered that Thomas's influence extended far beyond simple intimidation. The boy had spent months documenting every safety violation. Every act of corporate violence, every family driven to starvation by company policies. Before leaving West Virginia, he compiled this information into detailed reports that found their way to newspapers in Charleston, Baltimore, and Washington. These reports became the basis for investigations that the coal company couldn't buy their way out of. The letters Thornton received from Ohio revealed Thomas's gradual transformation from killer to businessman. But they also contained details that made the sheriff question whether the boy had ever truly escaped the darkness that had consumed him. Thomas wrote about his education, his growing success in Cincinnati's business community, but always with an undercurrent of calculation that suggested he was still making plans, still preparing for future battles. By 1885, Thomas had become exactly what his grandfather had trained him to be: a weapon disguised as a pillar of society. His business empire included strategic investments in companies that manufactured mining equipment, railroads that served the coal industry, and even banks that financed mining operations. He wielded economic influence with the same precision others used firearms, applying pressure with surgical accuracy to protect workers' interests across 3 states. The miners of West Virginia never knew the real Thomas Weaver, but for decades they felt his protection. Union organizers found unexpected funding. Safety advocates discovered that company officials were surprisingly willing to negotiate. Miners' children received scholarships to attend schools far from home, breaking the cycle of corporate servitude that had trapped their parents. When Thomas died in 1924, hundreds attended his funeral in Cincinnati, knowing him only as a generous philanthropist. But that same week, miners across Appalachia reported strange incidents. Supervisors planning to cut safety measures suddenly changed their minds. Company officials resisting union negotiations abruptly became accommodating. Several particularly brutal mine guards simply vanished without explanation. The 3 graves by Elkhorn Creek were discovered during a flood in 1915, but by then the remains could only be identified as those of unknown victims of labor violence. Investigators never found the 4th grave, hidden deeper in the forest, containing the remains of Henry Coldwell, the informer who had betrayed Samuel's petition. Thomas had saved him for last, visiting on a cold February evening in 1876, just days before leaving for Ohio. Sheriff Thornton took the secret of this final killing to his own grave, but in his journals, discovered after his death in 1899, there was one chilling entry. The boy understood something the rest of us never will: that evil creates its own enemies. And sometimes that enemy wears the face of a child who learned too young that mercy is a luxury the innocent can't afford. This story shows us that the most terrifying transformations don't come in moments of supernatural horror, but through the slow corruption of innocence by systematic cruelty. Thomas Weaver wasn't born a killer. He was carefully crafted by people who never imagined their victims might learn to hunt them in return. What do you think about this story? Could a child really orchestrate such a calculated revenge, or does this tale reveal something darker about what society creates when it discards its most vulnerable members? Leave a comment below with your theories about what really happened in the mountains of West Virginia. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, subscribe, hit the bell, and share it with others who love dark mysteries. See you in the next video.